Hey, what's up, good people? It's Jay Ray, the co host of Q Points, and I wanted to come to you because there are two really important ways that you can support our show. One is by subscribing to it wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts. Q Points is pretty much everywhere. The other thing that you can do is you can visit us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on Podchaser, and you can leave us a star rating. Please rate us 5 stars because you know you love Q Points. And on Apple Podcasts and on Podchaser, you can actually leave us a written review. It's not required, but it really does help to spread the word about the show, and it helps people to discover it as they're looking for new podcasts to listen to. We're always appreciative of you supporting Q Points. We thank you so much for all that you've done for us so far, and enjoy the show.
Greetings and welcome back to another episode of Q Points Podcast, dropping the needle on Black music history. I am DJ Sir Daniel.
And my name is Jay Ray, sometimes known by my government as Johnny Ray Cornegay III. What's happening, people?
Jay Ray, this is an auspicious moment for both of us because this particular episode listener, we have a real life author on the show.
We do.
Like a for real author, and the first of many to come, I'm sure. And, Jay Ray, in our discussions recently regarding hip hop, the 50th anniversary of hip hop, I think that this journey we're about to go on with our guest is actually a very integral part of the hip hop story, and I believe needs to be told. And I don't know if our guest realizes that he is in fact documenting a very pivotal moment in hip hop history. So, I think typically we go into a lot of, chitter chatter between the two of us, but I think this time around it's very important that there's so much for us to cover.
Yes.
So I would like for us to get into the bio of our guests. I'm feeling smart right now. I have on my readers.
You got your readers and everything.
Got my readers. So our guest on this episode of Q Points Podcast is none other than Donovan X Ramsey. Donovan X Ramsey is a journalist, author, and voice on issues of race politics and patterns of power in America. His reporting has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, GQ, The Wall Street Journal, Ebony, and Essence. He has been a staff reporter for the Los Angeles Times, News One, and The Griot, and has served as an editor at the Marshall Project and Complex. Ramsey holds a master's degree from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Morehouse College. Donovan's latest book is titled When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. When Crack Was King follows 4 individuals to give us a startling portrait of crack's destruction and devastating legacy. Weaving together riveting research with the voices of survivors, When Crack Was King is a crucial reevaluation of the era and a powerful argument for providing historically violated communities with the resources they deserve. Q Points family, please welcome Donovan X Ramsey.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very warm introduction.
Absolutely, we are beyond thrilled, like I said in the intro, Donovan, to have you on to discuss When Crack Was King, because as we said, the crack epidemic is a very pivotal moment in hip hop history. As a matter of fact, I think if you look at it, the the growth, the boom of the hip hop industry and culture coincided with the growing crack epidemic in the streets. And so I think it's such an important time to have you on to discuss your book. And first and foremost, we are super proud of you about the book. I remember the first time we met, you told me about the book, but that's a story for, off the air. But I am so excited for you. J. Ray and I have lived with this book for months now.
Lived with this book for months, and what is so beautiful about it, Donovan, is that the stories feel so real. There were, for me personally, there were 3 times where I just had to put the book down. I was like, okay, pause. We're going to come back.
Okay.
and that's a good thing, right? That means the stories are doing what they need to do. They're making us think and they're making us feel, right? One of the other beauties about your book is that it takes this topic that Sir Daniel and I have lived through, right? And it allows us to revisit it in a way that adds a lot of context, because as things are happening, you're getting one message, but then when you do a hindsight 2020, you like, oh, there's a whole other message here that we were completely missing, right? What inspired you to even write this book and revisit this era in American history?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I wrote this book because I grew up in a community in Columbus, Ohio in the early 90s that was still dealing with the crack epidemic. That these Midwestern cities were hit later than the cities on the coast. I remember, people like my neighbor Michelle down the street, who I kind of opened the book writing about because she was somebody that I never really got to see or spend time with, but she was the talk of the town, right? Everybody talked about how much of a problem Michelle was and how much of a problem her house was. And my most vivid memory of her is in the middle of the night when I'm trying to go to sleep in my bed and I can hear Patti LaBelle's "If Only You Knew" playing on a loop in the background. And that was Michelle. She would like to, she would get high, I guess, and she would listen to Patti LaBelle. She would play that song over and over again. And even though I was maybe 5, in my dark bedroom, I could feel that she was trying to communicate something, that like she was going through something. She was saying, if only you knew, right, the changes I'm going through. And, she disappeared from the neighborhood, but I never lost that curiosity about her, about who she was and what it was she was going through. So this book, you talk about it bringing context to the individuals who, used crack or who, sold crack. I guess that was what I was trying to do, is I was trying to get to know Michelle and people like her better. And as a result, trying to get to know us better, right? Because Michelle was a part of our community, and but for the grace of God go I. And, and when I look back, I think that this is so meaningful to me because I know that could have been my mother, that could have been my sister, that could have been me.
Absolutely.
Really quickly, I'm curious, what was the most challenging thing for you writing this book?
Yeah. I thought it would be the reporting, right? I thought it would be trying to get people to talk to me about oftentimes some of like the most difficult parts of their life. That wasn't hard. That a lot of people were, spilling, that people had this like well of experience that they wanted to share with not just me, but with other people. And they were, it was like these stories were always kind of on the tip of their tongues. The hardest thing for me was having to hear the stories. And, I had always prided myself on being able, as a journalist to hear stuff and to process it and then to move on. But, I spent 5 years researching and reporting and writing out this book. And at the end of it, I was a wreck. from just kind of living vicariously through, the hundreds of folks that I interviewed, and ultimately the 4 people whose stories I write about. That I'd lost 40 pounds. I had heart palpitations, and I was wearing a heart monitor because just the stress and like the secondhand trauma of hearing people's stories, and then also having like my own stuff triggered, right? Like growing up in a neighborhood where, you knew to get on the ground when you heard gunshots.
Yeah.
And then you went back to, having dinner like it was nothing, or, having my first bike stolen by an addict. And the stress of having to go home and say, I don't have my bike anymore because, the tire popped and this guy said that he could help me and he ran off with my bike. You know what I mean? All of that came flooding back in. But what I will say is this, is that writing the book helped me process it. And I hope that it helps readers process their own stuff too.
And listening to you say that, and we're going to talk about that some more, about how each of us, the change that we felt in our respective neighborhoods when the epidemic really took off. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I want to say thank you for those 5 years of research, because there are often, and I'm, not to give away too much of the book, but there has always been this mythology amongst the community, especially the Black community, about exactly how crack got in our community, got in our neighborhoods. Even some of our favorite rap songs like to say that crack was like legit put in the community, planted in the community. But your book helps to debunk some of those myths. And can you just, for our briefly for our audience, just tell us a little bit about maybe exactly what led to the crack distribution in our communities, or where crack showed up? Because it's not something that was created in a lab somewhere.
Right.
You eloquently tell us exactly how crack became to form, and then, but just a little bit for the listeners, because we still want them to buy the book, but just for a little bit, tell them how it happened.
Yeah, well, I knew going into it that this book would not be complete if I didn't ask and answer that question. Did the government, namely the CIA, distribute crack in Black neighborhoods to disrupt our communities? And the answer is complicated. And it's the reason why you write a book, right? So that way you can actually devote time to sort of building the story in the context of it. But the short answer is that the government turned a blind eye to the fact that crack was being distributed in Black neighborhoods, and that we were falling into a epidemic, for the same reasons that the government turns a blind eye to everything else that impacts Black communities first and worst, because of anti-Black racism. So, the truth is actually sadder, I think, than the idea of a conspiracy, right? To like create crack in a lab and then to drop it into communities, systematically. The truth is that Blackness is as such. It is a position as much as it is an identity. Blackness in America means that you are marked to be hit first. That whatever hits America, like I said, you will get it first and worst. Whether it is something like Hurricane Katrina, whether it's something like COVID, that a disaster that happens, because as Black folks, we are pushed out towards the margins, that it gets us first and we get it worse than anybody else. That's the way that it was with crack. Was, the long story kind of short is that there was a glut of cocaine in South and Central America, that the United States allowed folks that we were supporting in South and Central America to bring into the US so they could raise funds to sort of turn over governments. And, we had interest over there, and we were like, we can't give y'all money, we can't give you weapons, but we can let y'all make some money. So they, shipped cocaine into the US and they made money that way. And the consequence of it was that there was a lot of cocaine in the country and people started experimenting with it, right? That like there's a lot of it, so it becomes cheaper. And with anything that there's a lot of, people say, well, how else can I consume this?
Mm-hmm.
And I would sort of liken it for anybody that kind of wants to wrap their head around it is, there's a lot of weed in the country today. And people will figure out, okay, I can make edibles, I can do a vape, I can do this like, oil or this hash or whatever it is, these different ways of consuming. And people were experimenting with cocaine the same way in the 70s and early 80s. And there's a group of students, white college students in the Bay Area, who were supposedly chemistry students that that used a chemical process called freebasing, where you free the base of a compound from its other elements. And that's how we got the first name for crack. It was freebase. And what that did was it made cocaine smokable.
Mm-hmm.
If you try to burn powdered cocaine, it destroys it. But if you free the base of it from the other elements, it's a smokable substance. And once something is smokable, it goes directly to your brain. It gets you high very quickly. And it's a very intense high that doesn't last very long. Mm-hmm. So with that, they had created not a new drug, it's the same drug as powdered cocaine chemically, but something that would be cheaper and super accessible. And it just took off like wildfire from there. It, traveled the normal paths of commerce and relationship from the Bay Area to Los Angeles. And once it was in Los Angeles, it just took off, all throughout the country. Then it came to New York, and then there was a taste for it in New York. So then people started bringing cocaine into New York through Florida and, other places down south. So, and Black folks really paid the cost of some pretty intense negligence on the part of the government. And then they turned around and criminalized us for it.
Right.
So I think that, it's hard for it to not feel like a conspiracy because it's all too convenient, right? That like this thing happens and then you have this perfect tool to criminalize Black communities. But again, I think that the truth is a lot sadder than the fiction, which is that, they could use COVID to criminalize us, right? Mm-hmm. You didn't get your vaccine. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Right. You didn't, you didn't leave New Orleans during Katrina. Well, now we can do all manner of things to you or allow all manner of things to happen to you because of a choice that you did or didn't make. So I thought I would say long story short, but that is the story of how crack got into our communities.
And, one of the things that you highlight in your book that was heartbreaking in its truth is because there have been so many disappointments for Black folks leading up to the rise of crack. It also made it much easier for us to search for that level of escape. Right.
Yeah.
And I remember reading about that. You were actually talking about it as it related to like Baltimore, how they didn't really have a drug market. And then all of a sudden there was this big one. Right. But also the despair of the folks made that so much easier. Right. And going back to that blind eye of being able to say, we're not going to deal with this until we absolutely have to. One of the other things that happened in the same era, and it was handled the same way, was HIV in the Black community, where it's like, we're not going to deal with this until we have to. And so you have in the 80s, all of the stuff that was happening with the Reagan administration. You have the crack epidemic happening, and you have HIV. This is all hitting Black folks at the same time.
I think is a really incredible point. One of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is because I am an 80s baby that, I was born in 1987. So both crack and HIV AIDS predate me, that I don't know a world where those things don't exist. And I really wanted to write this book. And the reason why it is such a thick book is that it starts in the pre-crack era. So you can actually feel what we lost in our community. And that like, that's an important distinction to make. And it's something that I wanted to underline in the book that, this happened to us because we were devastated. And that's something that people understand in the context of something like opioids now, right? That they talk about white communities in rural America being disaffected.
Yes.
They say,
Yeah.
oh, they voted for Trump because they were disaffected, that they use opioids because they're disaffected, that they're hopeless and they don't know, what to do about the economy and, where they are politically. Well, what do you think we were in 1980s after our leaders had been assassinated, after we had, launched civil rights and Black power movements and elected Black mayors, and we saw nothing from it? We were disaffected and we were looking for escape. And, people forget about this when they think about addiction, but it is a way to check out. It's a way to escape. It makes you feel good. So, cocaine is something that it produces euphoria in users. Black folks needed to feel euphoric, and nothing else made us feel that way. And that's why we were so susceptible to the crack cocaine epidemic at that time. It's not because we're bad people, because we make, particularly bad choices that other folks don't make. We were in a bad position.
I remember seeing a very real change in how we were allowed to be children.
Yes.
And how we were allowed to be outside, and noticing all of these little containers on the ground that either have red caps or blue caps, and not knowing what that was, but knowing, hey, stay away from that. And to J. Ray's point about the HIV epidemic, also noticing needles on the ground, and everywhere we went, it's like, be careful where you're sitting, be careful where you're stepping when you're playing, watch out for these items because it's dangerous. You don't want to touch anything. You don't want to get stuck by needles. So that, I just remember that plainly growing up. And then also, I think, and this goes back to is it Lennie
Ooh,
in the
that
book?
story was hard, bruh.
So going back to Lennie, it reminded me of how hard the epidemic hit women in our community.
Yes.
I specifically remember one night, one of my friends, her dad picked us up, said, "Hey, we're going to go to the, a street fair." Where they said in the hood, we thought it was the best thing ever because we from the hood, we from Brooklyn, right? And so there's a Ferris wheel, there's a little spin around carousels, there's a merry-go-round, all of that. And I just remember not going out that much at night, but we went at night because it was, the lights looked better, all of that, right? And I specifically remember getting there and hearing Slick Rick's the Ruler's Back just pumping throughout the system, right? And seeing this one woman, she was very slender. She had on a very tight acid wash outfit. She had a very stingy ponytail at the top of her head. And I remember the looks on the other people, like other women, looking at her because she was feeling it. She was holding on to one of the rails, and she's, gyrating. She is just getting it on like nobody's business. Today, we would just say, "Oh, she's lit," and we would probably join in with her. But back then, I remember them specifically singling her out and hearing the whispers. "Oh, well, she's and she does this for." And so that was one of my very earliest memories of seeing how the drug epidemic hit our women, and how the women in our community were affected by just the visual perception of what they were doing to get these drugs.
Yes.
Again, as a community, we're trying to feel better. But on top of that, add to that, if you are the main caregiver in the household and you have this habit, not only are you trying to take care of your kids by doing things for money, you're chasing a high as well. And so that's a lot for a community to deal with. That's why all the aftercare programs started popping up in school, because a lot of these moms just weren't able to get there on time to pick up the kids or necessarily have food at the house to feed the kids. And so I thank you for making that a very big part of the book as well, and highlighting how Black women got an extra lashing
Yeah.
because of the epidemic.
Yeah, that's a great point. Lennie is one of the main four characters that I profile in the book. She grew up in South Central LA. She grew up what they call the Rolling 60s and saw the forming of the Rolling 60 Crips. Nipsey Hussle was one of those Rolling 60 Crips. And she ended up in that position because she just suffered a lot of abuse growing up. So, it was terrible enough what was happening inside of her home, but then she sort of left the home as a teenager into a community that, all that it had to offer her was sex work and drugs.
Yeah.
And, she literally didn't know any better, before she knew it, she was using crack for decades.
Yeah.
And involved in sex work for decades. Now, what I should say is that it's important to underline that Lennie survived it,
Yes.
and that Lennie is a drug counselor helping other people into recovery for whatever substance they may be abusing because she saw the worst of it as a Black woman. That there's no place that anybody that's dealing with addiction has been that she hasn't been. And that story, is so striking to me, Sir Daniel, that you tell, because what it reminds me of is that many of us grew up in these neighborhoods that were like steel towns where nobody talked about steel.
Right.
So, it's like
Yeah.
it is the economy of the neighborhood that, you hear the whispers, so-and-so is on that shit. Or,
Yeah.
you know what she doing, or, you don't go down that street because that's where they be at. And, then you grow up feeling like you understand what the crack epidemic was, but you never really had the conversations that you needed to have. Basic things like a conversation with an addict, like, what made you want to use crack? Why did you use it for so long? When I interviewed Lennie, that was one of the first things that I said to her was, what made you, smoke crack for decades? And she said, because it felt good. She was like, I can't tell you how good I felt when I smoked crack. That, even now in recovery, I can acknowledge that it felt good and I had a great time until I didn't. And by the time that I was not having a good time, I was stuck. And, and that's real. And people don't necessarily want to hear that because it's not the, oh, I can't believe I did it. She's like, no, people use drugs because drugs feel good. And
That's
if
it.
we don't acknowledge that, then we're not doing that dynamic a service. But yes, that's a part of why I wrote the book, so that those of us that have those kind of memories can actually investigate what were the stories behind scenes just like that.
Yeah. Wow. So you absolutely true. We've been having that conversation as well as it relates to crystal meth use, particularly among the Black gay men in the community. And one of the conversations we had was about that very thing. Like, we have to acknowledge the fact that for folks this feels good and provides an escape. We got to start there. I do vividly remember my community changing. So when you say you're talking about a steel town and nobody talks about steel, that's where I live. I live in Chester, Pennsylvania. This was an industrial city where they took down, there used to be a sign over the train station that said, "What Chester makes Chester." They took the sign down. The industry packed up for the most part and left along with the white folks. And we were here, right? So I remember in the mid 80s watching folks who I'd known up to that point my entire life, right? Suddenly change. But as a kid, watching my neighborhood descend into something that I don't recognize. That really stuck with me. And you still see the it still is here, right? All that stuff that I saw then, the remnants of it still exist as you drive in
Right.
my city.
Yeah, I mean, I would call that cracks residue. That like we are still dealing with the fallout from the epidemic, even though, we have seen its decline in that, the rate of new drug users is nowhere near, what it was in the mid 80s, and it's not recovering, that we still deal with a lot of shame. We still deal with abandoned communities that have been really divested from. And we still deal with a criminal justice system that was created to respond to crack that has not caught up with the fact, right, that the epidemic is over, that we are still policed like we are in the midst of a crack epidemic. But, J. Ray, I want to circle back to something that you mentioned because, something that I was able to connect in writing this book is that the cities that were hard hit by crack were actually great migration cities, right?
Yeah.
So I was inspired, because when you look at the country, so when we talk about the crack epidemic, we talk about Black communities, we, think as though there was this, monolithic experience, but not every Black community around the country had a crack epidemic, that they happened at different times. But, when I did the research and made a list of the cities that were hardest hit, I saw, and I traveled to all these places, in my research in 2018, I went to the hardest hit cities, but it was Newark, it was New York, it was Baltimore, it was DC, it was Oakland, it was Chicago. It was like, I mean, I'm talking about great migration cities.
Yes.
So after doing the reporting and then kind of laying it out in this history, I was able to see really a story of Black people leaving the South for opportunity and leaving in droves and getting to cities that were not prepared for us and that didn't want us. So we were met with shaky opportunity. We were met with poor housing that, those of us that were able to really claw a little piece of something, right? To be able to like, buy some homes and set up a neighborhood, that we were in what felt like middle class neighborhoods, but they were working class neighborhoods, that they were held together by the fact that we could work.
Yes.
And when the opportunities for work, right, in places like where you grew up went away, what we then what had been working class neighborhoods became ghettos.
Yeah.
They became places of concentrated poverty. And then you see the decline, right? Then, that these neighborhoods don't decline because crack was dropped in, that they were on the decline. And that's why crack is able to take off in them.
Yeah.
And that for me, there were all of these connections that you're talking about, great migration cities that didn't really welcome Black people. And then, there were these big efforts in the 70s and 80s to elect Black mayors.
Yes.
So almost 201, you start seeing as the white folks move out with white flight, then we have population power and we say, let me get Dinkins in New York. Let me get, Kenneth Gibson in New Jersey. Let me get Tom Bradley in LA. I mean, literally to the one, we really tried our damnedest to save our neighborhoods. But what happens if you don't have a tax base to actually respond to the issues? What happens if, the jobs just don't come? And people understand that in the context of white Americans and what they're going through right now, right? They, will talk into their blue in the face about coal country and how, they're using opioids in coal country because coal's not coming back, or in the Rust Belt because the auto industry isn't coming back. But they don't want to talk about all the factories that got closed down in big cities and left Black communities devastated and young Black men without jobs. And then you wonder why it is they want to sell crack. Well, because you got to live. And anybody that's been a Black teenager understands that angst of trying to find your first job.
Yes.
Wanting to be in the world, wanting things, right? Wanting to be able to buy your own things, feeling the pressure that puts on your family, and being like, Why won't Foot Locker hire me?
Right.
Why won't Applebee's hire me?
Yes.
And if I could just get a little something to be comfortable, right? Like not even to be rich. The guys that were selling drugs for the most part were nickel and dime, and they were just trying to buy some sneakers. They were just trying to buy a bike. You know what I mean? And that's how we got caught up like that. That there were these social conditions that made it almost inevitable.
You know, can we stay on that for a second? So okay, the economic part of the whole crack epidemic. I'm so glad you brought up the neighborhood, the hood star, which is the drug dealer,
Mhm.
which looking fly and feeling good is such a black thing. We love to
Yeah.
look good, we love to feel good, and there's nothing wrong with that. Another story, I just remember talking about another migration. I'm part of the West Indian migration that happened in New York in the late 70s, early 80s, right? And so that's a community that I saw become part of especially the Jamaicans, become part of that economic loop within the community of bringing drugs or selling drugs in the
Yeah.
community, but also that the Hood Star took care of the community at the same time.
Yes.
But it was different. But I remember my mom was like, okay, I knew what they looked like. They had on the silk shirts, the silk trousers, the travel fox sneakers, the
Uh-huh.
gabardines, the Kango slightly
Yep.
tilted to the side, the gold chain. Those guys were solid. They were always driving a Maxima, a tricked out Maxima. And that system was always knocking, and that was something to aspire
Aspire
to
to.
or
Yes.
somebody to look up to, especially if you were in the hip hop game. Let's just be honest. The drug lords, the hood stars, as I like to call them, were the ones that would pay for the concerts.
Right.
They would put
Mhm.
on the concerts in the neighborhood. You ask any of our hip hop forefathers, the kids from the golden era, who was paying them? You know what I'm saying? To
Right.
show up at the high school
The
cafeteria.
drug
They were
dealers.
getting the drug
Yeah.
dealers, they were getting paid. And it's like hip hop has had this this precarious relationship with crack, with the crack epidemic, because it was hurting us, but it was helping us to eat at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think, again, in your book, and I'm not saying this just because you're here and because you're the author of the book, but it was a really great, you've done a really great job of talking about that relationship, that love-hate
Mhm.
relationship that crack and black communities had in the late 80s, early 90s. And I just remember, as a kid, those Just Say No PSAs by Nancy Reagan, and Nancy Reagan popping up on different strokes. When I
Yes.
when I read that part in the book, I was gassed. I was like, "Here,
I forgot about
Donovan."
that till
I was like, Donovan knew that. Donovan
yes.
researched that and found that out. I remember seeing that.
Yes.
I remember seeing her standing next to Run DMC and just
Yep.
being, "This is a weird picture," and
Yeah.
so
It took you
and just
back.
no, it took me back, and it just reminded me of that relationship that we've had with this drug. It's almost like I don't know, like a hunter and a wild animal. It's like we see each other and we kind of respect each other from afar until it gets
Yeah.
too close to your home, and just those
You know
memories will
what?
be unlocked when you read this book.
That like you highlight something really interesting, and why those of us that actually like live the experience have a different relationship to the epidemic than what people on the outside might have, and how there was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, right, was this tension between what was said about the crack epidemic and the way that I had experienced it. And you bring up a figure that I refer to as the gentleman dealer, which is
Mhm.
that when you look at the 70s and 60s, that drug dealing was kind of like a player thing, right? It was like
Mhm.
you were like a
Yes.
guy that like went to the party, and you were a smooth guy and fun to be around. And that allowed you to sell drugs, usually in nightclubs, right? And in places where people hung out. So like you needed to look slick, and you needed to look good, and you needed to be attractive for people to want to come to you and feel comfortable spending money with you. And then there would be this reputation, right, that you were a guy that had money, and that, you know, maybe you sold a little weed, maybe you sold, you know what I mean? And that was the dynamic. So we had always, right, had that relationship to the gentleman dealer in our neighborhoods, that guy that was who you went to that you knew was connected to the underworld, right? And he still was in relationship to people in the community. But what you see with the response to the crack epidemic, right, is that that wave of guys get locked up early,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And then they are replaced then by waves and waves of typically younger guys who are not a part of that lifestyle and don't have a certain code of ethics. And not only that, but they're not dealing drugs indoors. They are doing open market drug dealing, right? So
Yes.
they are on street corners, which means that they're competing, which
Mhm.
then means that they have to then enforce turf,
Yes.
and you get turf wars. So then drug dealing becomes something that the average drug dealer is not somebody that's player. The average drug dealer is somebody that is gangster. And so then there is this shift. So then when Nancy Reagan or somebody's telling you this is what a drug dealer is, or, you know, Hillary Clinton's talking about super predators,
Right.
we're like, it's kind of more complicated than that.
Donovan, there is so much to this book. And we're just scratching the surface. Like, I have at least 4 other topics that are swirling in my head. But that's why both Sir Daniel and I agree that people definitely need to pick this book up. So I recently returned to my hometown about 3 years ago to care for my parents. And so I actually often see folks, because you talked about Lennie making it to the other side, right? Lennie's still here to tell her story. I get to see people here that I'm just like, yes, come on now. You know, and watching them work, and I could give them a hug and be like, they ask me about my mom and all of that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like,
You made
this
it.
person made it, right?
Yeah.
So Black folks are resilient and innovative. So your book, I think, is also a testament to like Black resilience to make it through this thing that a lot of people didn't want us to make it out of, right? So what's your thought on, you know, this story, these stories as a tool for documenting Black resilience, and what do you hope folks take away from this book?
I hope folks take away from the book that something like the crack epidemic happens because of unattended to devastation, things that we could wrap our hands around and really minimize or prevent. And also that Black folks survived the crack epidemic, like you said, because we are resilient, because our story in America starts with us surviving the Middle Passage. It starts with us surviving the horrors of the plantation. It starts with us surviving the horrors of Jim Crow. And even if you talk about, you know, other Black ethnic folks that, you know, immigrate here, they come from places that have plantations too. And they survive that. And they survive the distance of being away from family and building a new life in a new place and joining a new community and being different, but finding a way to like find some commonality. So we do community better than anybody, right? That we created community in the bowels of slave ships. We, you know, created cousins on plantations. And that is what kept us alive. And that, you know, I don't want people to look at the crack epidemic and think that it was some sort of failure as much as it was a trial. And we are in many ways stronger in the broken places. You know, it's like when you break a bone, they say that after it heals, you will never break that bone in the same place again, because when it fuses back together, it's so much stronger than the rest of the bone. So that's the way that we are. We are stronger in the places that we were broken. And maybe as a last little piece on that, what I would say is that what we did was, that we didn't solve the crack epidemic overnight, but it was these little acts of community care. It was grandmothers taking in grandchildren, while their kids were going through it. It was churches, housing people, and putting gun buybacks and stop the violence, events and campaigns. That's what we call harm reduction. And another word for that is just keeping each other alive. And don't discount the power of, you can't stay here for a week, but I can give you a place to sleep tonight. Don't discount the power of, let me buy you something to eat because I don't want to give you some money, but I can feed you tonight. Or maybe I can give you some money if that keeps you from knocking some old lady over the head. You know what I mean? That's the stuff that we did, and we survived it without any help because we did things like that.
Wow. Again, leave it to an author, a journalist, to be able to put it all together for us to take in that way, because I'm still thinking about this line about community and taking care of each other. And before we wrap up, I know we are a music podcast, and we talk heavily about a lot of the artists that we love that were part of that movement to make us feel good and feel better. But sadly, a lot of those artists succumb to their own demons. They needed to feel good too, Do you feel like, thinking back amongst those artists, whether it be in hip hop or R&B, Black artists specifically, do we as a community do right by them if it comes out that they have a habit?
Yeah. I think that we have not loved our people the way that we should because of shame, because of fear of that spreading onto us and it touching us and being marked by this thing that's so ugly. And my mind goes immediately to, Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston is the exact profile of somebody that used crack during the period. She grew up in Newark, which was a crack city, is a great migration city. She was young Black woman during the early 80s. She had a very high stressful life and career. At one point, she became isolated from her community and became vulnerable, right? She needed to feel good. And I think that at the time, because we were still dealing with so much, the only way that we could really respond was shame and ridicule. But that lady was going through. And she gave us so much, you know what I mean? And that, I don't think that we took care of her the way that we could have. I don't like people to make fun of Whitney Houston. She's like one of my ones, you know what I mean? Like that, that shit not funny, is one way that I would put it. Now what I will say is that she was a character and liked to cut up. Yeah. So, is also like a part of that feels like, oh, that's your auntie that, it is like going through something. But I, wish that we had appreciated the changes that she was going through, as Michelle from down the street, would say, which was that, she was trying to work through something. And, she got, in recovery for a while. But, I think that, it's very well documented that one of the effects that cocaine has on the body is that it really weakens the organs, especially the heart. And Whitney ultimately, according to the autopsies, died of a heart attack, when she was in the bathtub, and that all those years of cocaine use caught up with her, and I think that, it really is a cautionary tale, but I'm also inspired by Whitney Houston, because she made incredible music and she struggled through her artistry, and she struggled through her addiction, you know, and she ultimately is gone from us too soon. But it doesn't take away any of the beauty of her and her story and what she gave us. And we can still, and like, she can still be our princess, you know, that like, you know, that we fell in love with when she's saying, I want to dance with somebody. And we felt, you know, the hurt and the pain in her voice when she sang songs like, you know, why does it hurt so bad? You know what I mean? That she gave us the like width of that, all of that Black gospel expression that she made popular, and it still lives on today through people who don't even know that they're trying to sing like Whitney Houston. You know what I mean? So I honor that like I, you know, that I honor perfect Princess Whitney, but I also honor, you know, High Whitney. You know what I mean? Because all of it was her. And and I think that I hope that today that was to happen to a, you know, a pop superstar, that we would respond differently. You know, even if we can't help them personally, that we would just hold a place of compassion in our heart.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And while you were talking about Whitney Houston, the voice, this question popped in my mind. Kind of lighten it up a little bit and take it to another era. Okay, we're living in the audiobook era, right?
Yes.
Donovan X Ramsey, if you had a choice in your wildest dreams, who would narrate the audio version of When Crack Was King?
Well, I'm gonna break it to you. I narrated the audiobook.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
That's that on that.
And you know what? I mean, you know what? What I will say is that I would love, like, there are like lots of great voices out there. I love Andre Holland as an actor, and I think that he has a type of, like, you know, notably Black vocal expression, because, you know, a person has to sound Black,
right?
You know, that like in like whatever that means, right? That it needs to be a timbre, just an element to the voice that it feels like, okay, you actually went through this. But I read the book myself because there are parts of the book where I write about my experience, where I write about, you know, the loved ones that I lost to the epidemic, where I write about the sort of, you know, trauma and shame that I had to work through about growing up in a neighborhood where that was my experience, and then, you know, going into all of these other places in the world, and that being where I'm from, you know, and having to reconcile that, you know, and to make meaning of it. So it was really important for me to read the book myself and to uh, and to embody the words, because it's a statement to say, you know, I'm a kid that grew up, you know, raised by a young single mother in a neighborhood that was hard hit by crack, that was able to go on to Morehouse and Columbia and write for the New York Times and all of these great places. And I was able to do it not despite where I came from, but because of where I came from. And I'm taking all those people with me. You know, that like, I'm writing this book because I wanted to take all of our stories with me, and because I'm not going to let somebody else tell the story. And I'm not going to let journalism tell me that I have to be whatever they think objective is and not tell my story too. That I can tell these story while also telling my story. And that the story that I tell about crack has more meaning because of what I went through. So that's a long way of saying I read it, and it was hard to do, but I'm very happy that I did.
Donovan, we are happy that you not only read your audiobook yourself, but that you wrote this incredible book. So When Crack Was King by Donovan X Ramsey is officially out on July 11th. Wherever you get books and whatnot, you should pick this book up. Donovan, thank you so much for being with us for this very special episode of Q Points. Where can folks stay in contact with you? What's all the info so folks can reach out?
Yeah, please follow me on all platforms. I'm Donovan X Ramsey. It's just my name, DONOVAN X RAMSEY. And thank y'all for having me. Seriously, thank you for these amazing questions and this like fantastic conversation.
Just to echo J. Ray again, thank you for writing this book. It's a living document that we can still look towards and still be able to pull out stories that can still resonate with us today, and also help us not to repeat certain mistakes,
Yes.
but also is a testament to a lot of lives that have been lost to this epidemic. You have honored a lot of people by writing this book. So we thank you. And we thank you, Donovan X Ramsey, for being on Q Points podcast. J. Ray, I don't think there's anything more to say, but this has been an amazing episode. Thank you again to Donovan X Ramsey and to your team for working this out and making this happen. J. Ray, what do I say every episode? In this life, you have a choice. You can either pick up the needle or you can let the record play. I'm DJ Sir Daniel.
My name is J. Ray, y'all.
That's Donovan X Ramsey. And this has been Q Points Podcast, dropping the needle on Black music history. We will see you on the next go round. Peace.